Could the P-47 Thunderbolt actually beat every German fighter in World War II? Most people think the P-47 Thunderbolt was just another Allied fighter plane. They're dead wrong. This 7-ton monster changed everything about air combat over Europe, and what happened when it went head-to-head with Germany's best fighters is not what you'd expect. The year is 1943. American bomber crews are getting slaughtered over Germany. Every single day, dozens of B-17s and B-24s are torn apart by German fighters. The Luftwaffe is winning, and everyone knows it. The bombers need help desperately, but there's a problem. The fighters escorting them can't go far enough, can't fight long enough, and honestly, they're getting destroyed too. Then this absolute beast of a plane shows up, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. When pilots first saw it, they didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This thing weighed as much as a small truck. It had an engine so massive that the whole plane had to be built around it. Other fighters looked like elegant racehorses. The P-47 looked like someone strapped wings to a bulldozer. German pilots called it the Jug because it looked like a milk jug with wings. American pilots called it the same thing, but for them, it became a term of respect. Because this ugly, chunky fighter was about to prove something that nobody expected. Size doesn't always matter in a dogfight, but when you combine size with the right design, you get something truly special. Let me take you back to how this whole thing started. In the late 1930s, a bunch of aircraft designers were sitting around trying to figure out what would make the perfect fighter plane. Everyone agreed on the basics: fast, agile, heavily armed. But there was this one engineer at Republic Aviation named Alexander Kartveli who had a different idea. He looked at what was happening in the skies over Europe and saw something everyone else was missing. The Germans had the Messerschmitt Bf 109, fast, deadly, and it could climb like crazy. The British had the Spitfire, which was basically a work of art that happened to fly. Both of these planes were built on the same philosophy: keep it light, keep it nimble, and you'll win the dogfight. Kartveli thought that was stupid, not because those planes were bad, but because he saw a different kind of war coming. He knew that future air battles wouldn't just be about two planes dancing around each other at low altitude. They'd be fought at heights where the air was so thin you could barely breathe. They'd involve escorting massive bomber formations hundreds of miles into enemy territory. And pilots would need to survive not just one fight, but dozens of them. For that, you needed something completely different. So Kartveli designed the P-47 around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This engine was an absolute monster. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, producing over 2,000 horsepower. To put that in perspective, a modern Honda Civic has about 150 horsepower. This single engine had more power than 13 Civics combined. But here's where it gets interesting. That massive engine created a problem. How do you get a fighter plane to fly at high altitude where the air is thin? Other planes used turbochargers, but they mounted them in the engine. Kartveli did something wild. He put the turbocharger in the tail of the plane and ran a complex system of ducts through the entire fuselage. This meant the plane had to be big, really big. The first prototype rolled out in 1941. When test pilots saw it, their reactions were not positive. One pilot looked at it and said it was too heavy to be a fighter. Another said it looked like a flying milk bottle. The Army Air Corps brass weren't impressed either. They wanted something that could turn and twist with German fighters. This thing looked like it would fly like a brick. Then someone actually flew it. The test pilot pushed the throttle forward and the P-47 did something unexpected. It didn't just take off. It exploded into the sky. At altitude, where other fighters were gasping for air, the Thunderbolt was just getting started. It could reach speeds that made other pilots think their instruments were broken. In a dive, it could hit speeds that no other fighter of its time could match. But speed alone doesn't win dogfights. The real test came in 1943 when the first P-47 units arrived in England. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a terrifying rate. German fighters were having a field day. They developed tactics specifically designed to destroy B-17 formations. They'd come in fast, hit hard, and disappear before the escorts could react. The P-47 squadrons flew their first combat missions in April 1943. The German pilots saw these big American fighters and probably thought they'd be easy targets. They were about to learn a very painful lesson. The first few engagements were chaotic. P-47 pilots were still learning how to fight in this beast of a plane. They tried to turn with the Bf-109s and FW-190s and quickly realized that was a bad idea. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to turn fight. It was too heavy. When you tried to yank it around in a tight circle, it bled energy fast. German pilots who had been flying for years knew this. They'd bait the American pilots into turning fights and then shred them. In those early weeks, P-47 pilots were getting schooled. Some units took heavy losses. The critics back home started making noise. Maybe this plane really was too big to be a fighter. But then something changed. American pilots started figuring out how to use the Thunderbolt's strengths instead of fighting against them. They learned that you don't turn with a German fighter. You don't get into a slow-speed knife fight where agility matters most. Instead, you use your advantages. And the P-47 had advantages that no German fighter could match. First, altitude. The Thunderbolt could fight effectively at 40,000 feet. At those heights, the air is so thin that most planes struggle. Engines lose power, controls get sluggish. But the P-47's turbocharger kept pumping. Up there, it was in its element. German fighters had to strain to reach those heights, and when they got there, they were at the edge of their performance envelope. The Thunderbolt was just warming up. Second, dive speed. This is where things got really interesting. In level flight, a Bf-109 could outrun a P-47 at lower altitudes. But when you pointed the nose down, the Thunderbolt became something else entirely. It could dive faster than anything the Germans had. Pilots would regularly hit speeds over 500 miles per hour in a dive. That might not sound impressive now, but in 1943, that was approaching the speed of sound. This created a new tactic. American pilots would climb high, way higher than necessary. They'd position themselves above the German fighters. Then they'd wait. When German planes went after the bombers, the P-47s would dive. By the time the Germans realized what was happening, these 7-ton monsters were screaming down at speeds they couldn't match. The P-47 pilots would blast through, guns blazing, and then use their speed to zoom back up to altitude before the Germans could react. This was called boom and zoom fighting. Dive fast, hit hard, zoom away. Don't stick around for a turning fight. Use your speed and your altitude. The Thunderbolt was perfect for it, and it had one more advantage that was about to become crucial. It could take damage like no other fighter in the sky. Remember all that weight everyone complained about? A lot of it was structure. The P-47 was built like a tank. It had armor plating protecting the pilot. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when hit. Its air-cooled radial engine could take multiple cannon hits and keep running. German pilots would pump rounds into a P-47 and watch in disbelief as it just kept flying. There's this famous story from 1944. A P-47 pilot named Robert Johnson was escorting bombers over Germany when he got jumped by German fighters. They shot his plane to pieces, and I mean literally to pieces. His canopy was shattered. His tail was shredded. There were holes in his wings big enough to stick your head through. His engine was trailing smoke. Any normal fighter would have disintegrated. Johnson somehow flew that destroyed airplane all the way back across the English Channel and landed it. When ground crews examined the wreckage, they counted over 200 bullet and cannon holes. The plane was so damaged that they didn't even try to repair it. They just used it for parts, but it had brought its pilot home alive. Word of stories like this spread fast. Pilots started trusting the Thunderbolt. They knew it would protect them. Now let's talk about specific matchups, because this is where things get really interesting. The Germans had several different fighters in service, and each one presented different challenges. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the most common. It had been around since before the war started, and German pilots knew how to use it. The 109 was light, it climbed fast, and it could turn inside most Allied fighters. In a theoretical one-on-one dogfight starting from neutral positions, the Bf 109 had advantages. It could outturn the P-47. It could climb better from low altitude. An experienced German pilot in a 109 could potentially dominate an inexperienced American pilot in a Thunderbolt. But real combat wasn't theoretical, and it wasn't one-on-one. P-47 pilots learned to avoid the 109's strengths. If a Messerschmitt tried to climb after a Thunderbolt at high altitude, the American pilot would just keep climbing. Up at 30,000 feet, the P-47's turbocharged engine gave it superior performance. The 109 would struggle to follow. Then the Thunderbolt would reverse, dive down, and attack with a massive speed advantage. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was a different beast. This was Germany's other main fighter, and in many ways it was more dangerous than the 109. The 190 was heavier, more powerful, and incredibly well-armed. It could dive almost as fast as a P-47. It rolled faster than anything else in the sky. German pilots loved it because it was stable and deadly. When P-47s first encountered FW-190s, it was a real challenge. The 190 could match the Thunderbolt's diving speed, at least initially. It was faster at lower altitudes. In a rolling scissors fight where both planes are rolling and revering, the 190 had the advantage. But the P-47 still had its ace cards. It could outdive the 190 at high speeds. It could definitely outclimb it at altitude. And it was much tougher. There's this engagement from late 1943 that illustrates the matchup perfectly. A squadron of P-47s was escorting bombers when they got hit by FW-190s. The German pilots used smart tactics. They came in fast, attacked, and tried to extend away. But the P-47 pilots didn't chase at low altitude. Instead, they used their altitude advantage. They'd climb, force the 190s to follow, and then the German planes would start losing energy. At 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolts would reverse and catch the struggling FW-190s. Then there was the Messerschmitt Me 262. This is where things got scary. The 262 was the world's first operational jet fighter. It was insanely fast for its time. A P-47 could hit maybe 430 miles per hour in level flight. The Me 262 could do 540. In terms of pure speed, there was no contest. The jet was faster, much faster. But the Me 262 had problems. It was unreliable. Its engines would flame out. It needed long runways. It couldn't turn as well as propeller fighters because of its speed. And there weren't many of them. When pilots encountered Me 262s, they couldn't catch them in level flight. That was just physics, but they learned to catch them anyway. Me 262s had to slow down to land. They were vulnerable taking off. P-47 units started hunting them at their airfields. They'd patrol near known jet bases and wait. When a 262 came into land, wheels down, slow and vulnerable, the Thunderbolts would pounce. It wasn't exactly sporting, but this was war. The tactic worked. Many Me 262s were destroyed this way. In straight air-to-air combat, if a Me 262 pilot knew what they were doing, they could attack and escape before a P-47 could react. But most Me 262 pilots weren't experienced. Germany was running out of veteran pilots by 1944. Many jet pilots were young, barely trained, and they'd make mistakes. They'd turn to fight instead of using their speed. When that happened, they were in trouble. The P-47's heavy firepower meant you only needed to hit the jet once or twice, and its delicate engines would fail. Speaking of firepower, we need to talk about the Thunderbolt's guns. Most fighters carried 4 or 6 machine guns. The P-47 carried 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, all mounted in the wings. When a Thunderbolt pilot pulled the trigger, it was like unleashing a metal storm. Those 8 guns combined produced about 100 rounds per second of heavy machine gun fire. German fighters, by comparison, usually carried a mix of machine guns and cannons. Cannons hit harder per shot, but they carried less ammunition and had a slower rate of fire. The P-47's 850s meant that if you got your gun sight on target for even a second, you were putting a massive amount of firepower on that target. German planes would simply come apart under that barrage. There's also something psychological about it. Imagine you're a German pilot. You've just attacked a bomber and you're heading back to base. Suddenly, there's this massive American fighter diving on you from above. You hear the sound of 8 heavy machine guns opening up. Tracers are streaking past your canopy. Your plane is getting hit. Pieces are flying off. That's terrifying. Many German pilots would break off and run just from that. By mid-1944, the P-47 had proven itself completely. It wasn't just a good fighter. It had become one of the dominant aircraft over Europe, but the Thunderbolt's role was evolving. The P-51 Mustang had arrived, and it had one crucial advantage over the P-47: range. The Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The P-47, despite its size and fuel capacity, couldn't match that. So the P-47 units transitioned to a different role. They became fighter-bombers, and this is where the Thunderbolt's ruggedness really shined. Remember that massive engine and tough structure that made it perfect for ground attack? P-47 started carrying bombs, rockets. They went low and hit German targets on the ground: trains, trucks, tanks, airfields, anything that moved. This was incredibly dangerous work. Flying low and slow made you vulnerable to ground fire. German anti-aircraft guns, called flak, were everywhere. They'd throw up walls of explosive shells. Most fighters couldn't survive repeated ground attack missions. The P-47 could. Pilots would come back with their planes shot full of holes, patch them up, and go back out the next day. The Thunderbolt became legendary for ground attack. It destroyed more German equipment on the ground than any other Allied fighter. Thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of trucks and vehicles, but it never stopped being a capable air-to-air fighter. P-47 pilots racked up thousands of aerial victories throughout the war. When German fighters showed up, the Thunderbolts would drop their bombs and fight. So could the P-47 take on any German plane? Here's the honest answer. In the right hands, flown correctly, using proper tactics, yes. The P-47 could fight and beat any German fighter of World War II. It wasn't the best dogfighter. The Spitfire could outturn it. The Bf-109 was more agile. The FW-190 rolled faster. The Me-262 was way faster in level flight. But the P-47 didn't need to be the best at any one thing. It was good enough at everything, and it had unique combinations of strengths. It could fight at altitudes where other planes struggled. It could dive faster than anything with a propeller. It could take ungodly amounts of damage and keep flying. It had firepower that could shred any target, and it had range that let it escort bombers deep into Germany. More importantly, it was produced in huge numbers. Over 15,000 Thunderbolts were built during the war. That's more than any other Allied fighter except the P-51. Numbers matter. Having thousands of capable planes with well-trained pilots beats having a few dozen superior planes with exhausted pilots. The Germans knew this. By 1944, Luftwaffe pilots were reporting encounters with P-47s constantly. They respected the Thunderbolt. They knew it was dangerous. There are German pilot accounts where they talk about avoiding fights with P-47s when possible, because even if you won, the American pilot would probably survive, and you'd have used precious fuel and ammunition. That last point is crucial. Surviving mattered. The P-47 brought its pilots home. Its loss rate per mission was lower than most fighters. American pilots who flew both the P-47 and P-51 often preferred the Thunderbolt for combat because they trusted it. They knew that if things went wrong, if they got hit, If they had to fight their way out of a bad situation, the jug would probably get them back to base. There's this interesting comparison to make. In video games and movies, the best fighter is usually the one that can outturn everything else. The nimble, graceful plane that wins through superior maneuverability. They've proved that real combat doesn't work like that. A plane that's tough, fast in a dive, powerful and well-armed, can dominate even if it can't win a tight turning fight. The Thunderbolt pioneered tactics that would define American fighter doctrine for decades. Energy fighting, boom and zoom, using teamwork and altitude advantage to offset maneuverability disadvantages. Modern fighter pilots still learn these principles. The P-47 proved they work. By the end of the war in Europe, P-47s had shot down nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. They destroyed over 9,000 locomotives and countless vehicles on the ground. They'd flown over 500,000 combat missions. Hundreds of American pilots became aces flying the Thunderbolt. The 56th Fighter Group, which flew P-47s throughout the entire war, became the top-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The real measure of the P-47's success is that it changed what people thought was possible. Before the Thunderbolt, everyone assumed fighters had to be light and nimble. After the P-47, designers realized that other factors could matter just as much. Toughness, firepower, high-altitude performance, the ability to take a beating and keep flying. This influenced post-war fighter design significantly. Jets like the Thunderjet and F-105 Thunderchief were direct descendants of the P-47's design philosophy. They were big, tough, heavily armed planes that could do multiple roles. Even modern fighters like the F-15 and F-16 incorporate lessons learned from the Thunderbolt's operational history. So when we ask whether the P-47 could take on any German plane, we're really asking whether the American approach to fighter design could compete with the German approach. And the answer, proven in thousands of engagements over the skis of Europe, was yes. Not through any single overwhelming advantage, but through a combination of factors that made it an incredibly effective weapons system. The P-47 wasn't perfect. It was expensive to build. It used more fuel than other fighters. In the Pacific Theater, where long range over water was crucial, it couldn't compete with the P-51. There were situations where you'd rather have a different plane, but in the specific role of escorting bombers over Europe and fighting German interceptors, the Thunderbolt was exactly what was needed. What makes this even more interesting is that the P-47 wasn't designed in response to the German fighters. It was designed before America even entered the war, based on predictions about what would be needed. Alexander Kartveli and his team at Republic Aviation somehow got it right. They predicted that high-altitude performance would matter, that toughness would be crucial, that heavy firepower would be necessary. They were proven correct in the most definitive way possible. The legacy of the Thunderbolt extends beyond just its combat record. It proved that American industrial capacity could produce highly capable weapons in massive quantities. Every P-47 was a complex machine with thousands of parts, yet they rolled off assembly lines by the dozens every single day. That manufacturing capability, combined with effective design, is what won the air war. German pilots faced an impossible situation. Even if they could outfly individual American pilots, even if their planes had certain advantages, they were facing an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. Every shot down would be replaced within days. Every American pilot lost would be replaced by fresh pilots coming through the training pipeline. Germany couldn't match that. This is the real answer to our question. Could the Thunderbolt take on any German plane during World War II? As an individual aircraft in a vacuum, it had strengths and weaknesses against each opponent. But as a weapons system, supported by American industrial might, training programs, and tactical doctrine, it absolutely could and did take on everything Germany had to offer. And it won. Hit subscribe for more untold stories from World War II.